What does feminism, racism, and Zionism have in common? Yep, they are all psyops. But the biggest psyop of them all is feminism. I'm gonna prove it to you. Let's get into it. So, what was behind the movement? In fact, it wasn't even called a feminist movement, it was called the suffrage movement. Suffrage is as in votes, right? It was really framed as a need for women to vote. And for those of you that think that the feminist movement came as a result of women's oppression, you are under a psyop. You've been lied to because that's not the reason. In fact, here's a paper from 1913 from the National Union of Women Suffrage Societies. The president was Miss Henry. I don't know if it's Fawcett or Force, whatever. Do you know what is not on here? There is no argument saying that women are being oppressed. This is why we're doing this. You can argue that they are calling for representation, but it had nothing to do with oppression. So, first of all, the idea that women will be oppressed, and that is why we're being oppressed in this patriarchy, and that is why this movement was born, is a flat out lie. That is how they frame it, but that's a lie. In fact, it is such a lie that in reality, over 90% of women at the time were actually against this stuff. This is the part where I kind of blame the men for feminism. But that's besides the point. The point of the matter is 95 plus percent of women actually didn't support this. So most women at the time didn't want this. You gotta wonder why, right? Why? Why didn't they want this? Well, I'm gonna use the breadwinner legal framework of New York. This was the law of the land in New York around in late 1800s, early 1900s, around that time frame. Women, whenever they got into a marriage, were allowed to keep their inheritance, and if there was a separation, they kept what they came with. Okay? Women didn't have to pay debt, meaning that if you got into debt and you're married, you become one entity, so your husband actually becomes responsible for that debt. In fact, even though they're saying that women were being oppressed and men had control of everything, as a man at that time, if you are in a marriage, you are not allowed to sell your assets without the consent of your wife, and the court will make sure your wife is not being coerced to sign. So the idea that it was oppression, it was a patriarchy keeping women down, that's not so true. And so in reality, I think this was really driven by a couple of things. One, flat out hatred of men, period. And two, it was also driven by capitalistic greed, in that the Henry Fords of the world, the Carnegies, and the Rockefellers of the world, indirectly through their quote unquote philanthropy, supported this movement because they wanted more cheap labor, aka women, to come and work for them. And the powers that be understood that whenever you work, you have to pay taxes, and therefore that was a new tax revenue, and nobody really factored in what the social consequences were going to be. And so here are some stats for you. One, women, generally speaking, whenever women get highly educated, the birth rate goes down. This is true in America, this is true in Europe, this is true in China, this is true in Japan, this is true in South Korea. There's only one continent on the planet that doesn't have that problem. It's Africa. Go figure. Most feminists, the people, the suffragists, the pro-suffragists at the time, almost all of them were occultists, and they practiced witchcraft, and they spoke to spirits, and they sold snake oils. And if you really pay attention, there's a corollary. If you look at the feminists today, they tend to have those spiritual beliefs. They believe in Lucifer. They hate Christians. And some of them even support Islam, which is funny because as a religion, that is literally a religion that oppresses women, quite literally, which is not true for Christianity. But I digress. Prior to the 1970s, only about 5% of women actually worked outside of the home. Today, that number is roughly anywhere between 60 to 80%, depending on how you look at it, and depending on what part of what you're looking at. But there's a whole lot more women in the workforce today. It means more tax revenue. It means more labor available. There's more competition. Therefore, wages are going to stagnate. You wonder why nowadays you're unable to provide for a household without two incomes. I wonder if that has something to do with the fact that women got into the workforce. So, feminism was never based on oppression. In fact, it's the opposite. It's based on a giant lie. And therefore, this takes me to one dangerous conclusion. Everybody knows that Africa is the only place that has above average or replacement birth rate levels, above replacement birth rate levels on the planet. And we all know what Bill Gates is trying to do. We all know that these people are trying to kill Africa. Because if nobody does anything, everything stays constant, everybody else dies and Africa lives. That is quite literally the physical reality of the world today. All Africa has to do is just wait. Everybody's going to die and they're going to thrive. They're going to take over the planet. That's quite literally what's going to happen. But no. These people are going to come to Africa and start telling us we need to educate our women. And it's going to sound sweet in the ear. But what you don't know is that what they have learned from educating their women is that it destroyed their society. That is why you have feminism. That is why feminism is so poisonous. And so, if you take anything from this video, let it be this. I'm not out here saying that women should not get educated. Because the fact of the matter is, before the suffrage movement, women were being educated. But society wasn't this divided. Women were not pitted against men. There was never a psyop to turn men against women, but there has been this giant psyop to turn women against men, and it's turned society upside down. The order of things has always existed that men run the big things, women run the home. And these people decided to ignore human nature, ignore the nature of how how we are wired on average. Because some people are going to start saying, well, are you saying that women cannot do women? Shut the fuck up. I'm talking in generalities. The exception doesn't make the rule. There was always roughly 5 to 10% of women that worked out of the home prior to all of this. That's not the conversation. I'm talking about the 80-90% of women that did women shit and there was peace and tranquility on the planet. Now everybody has a hot head because of this nonsense. We're tired of this. Feminism is a dangerous poison that needs to be neutered. Speaking of which, I don't know how to fix that problem. But that's besides the point. The point is, feminism is really dangerous. It was never created because they cared about women. It was created out of two things: hatred for men and greed from capitalistic hawks, sharks. Learn that today.